Hello lovelies, how are you all doing today? I hope you're well. I am. It's an incredibly sunny, bright day again today. Super warm, far too warm for October. It's a bit weird. Beans, hang on. Now that I'm down to just one freezer, I have to do all my bean freezing in batches. That's what today is about. We're going to chat all things beans, drying them, freezing them wet, freezing them dry, all things bean storage. Now, these ones I've just taken out, I love it when the glass has got that kind of bloom, that frost on it. Please note, all the glass jars that these have gone in to go into the freezer, they're all food grade jars, so they can stand that lower temperature in the same way that if I was making jam and putting boiling hot jam in, they could stand the hot jam temperature. Yeah, they're out of the freezer and they'll just stay there now to come back up to room temperature before I decant them. But I'll explain all that properly. We'll have a sit down. I've got tons of props to help me explain absolutely everything today, and hopefully this will be a sort of definitive guide to harvesting, prepping for storage and storing our beans. That's better. It's always much more comfortable to have a sit down chat. Right, so very first thing to make sure I'm really clear about, or delivering the message clearly, are two things. One, this is what I do. This is what has worked for me for years. It works, it's all very easy, it works brilliantly. There are other methods, people have other methods. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it and that I'm right and other people are wrong. No, I'm just literally sharing what I do and what's worked well for me over the years. And when I'm talking beans today, for the rest of this video, I'm talking about, this is my sad little example, I'll explain why in a sec. I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about what's inside it, the actual bean seed, if you like, but I'm not going to call it bean seed because that's going to confuse with seed saving, which I'm going to briefly mention right at the end. So yeah, when I'm talking about beans, I'm talking about what's inside, not the pod. All of my bean pods get discarded. If they're gorgeous and young and green, of course you can make a pod soup, but generally mine are a little bit beyond that. So all the pods get discarded, back into the garden, into the compost heap, spread on the top of the beds, etc, etc. I'm not talking about beans that you would have been harvesting all through the season, where you're going to eat the entire pod, so you're going to slice them up, steam them, whatever. Just the beans inside. Okay, so I use two methods to store my beans. You will have heard me, and this is why I want to do this video today, to try and clarify everything. You'll have heard me talking about freezing them demi-sec, D-E-M-I-S-E-C, demi-sec. The literal translation, excuse me, is from French, is half dry, but they're not really half dry even. So I freeze them when they're still wet. And I talk about freezing them when they're wet rather than saying when they're green, because some of the beans I grow, some of the beans you will grow, they won't be green. So saying freezing them green is a little bit of a misnomer. Don't want anyone making mistakes. Not because you're going to kill yourself, but I just want you to get the best from your harvest. So the two methods, one, I freeze them demi-sec, wet, green, or I store them dry. So let's deal with demi-sec first. When is the best time to pick what's the optimum moment to harvest? It's a bit tricky. You kind of will just have to try and learn as your growing years go by. But essentially, you'll have seen the pod formed. Now, I wanted to bring a green or a wet bean to show you today, but of course we're right at the end of this season. That's the nearest I could find to green, and you can see it's well on its way to wanting to be dry, but you can feel it's fleshy. It doesn't feel wet as such, but you can feel that there's moisture in there. So you can see the pod forming. It's lovely bright green. When you look sideways, you won't see, you can see in this one, you won't see the beans have swollen. So the perfect time for harvesting is just a little bit, so you see this pod's going a bit yellow, it's getting really old. So ideally for freezing, I would have wanted to pick this probably about 2 weeks ago, never mind. Essentially you're waiting for those beans to get big and fat, but you want to catch it before that moment when they start, for instance in this variety, going a bit yellow with the cocoa de pampol before they go completely pinky purple. You want them at that creamy white stage, but don't worry too much about that. Just concentrate on how fat are they in the pods, and once you can see they're nice and fat, get them off. And this is why I love freezing them, it's so easy. I'm going to go through some pros and cons of both methods in a sec. Yeah, these beans are past their best, they're looking a bit manky, but this is just for demonstration purposes. They look like they've been attacked by, yeah, they look like they've probably had a bean weevil going into them. So I've podded them, obviously there's only 3, these are gigantes, so they're always big. So I'll have an afternoon, evening, sitting on the sofa, pod into a bowl, bring that in the kitchen, get out all my takeaway Tupperware, and just go along in the row, dollop in there, dollop in there, dollop in there, fill up each little container. Each container, each one of these contains the equivalent of about 450 to 500 grams. So it's the equivalent of a tin can, or I think in the States it's that the equivalent of a pound. But yeah, if you think about a tin can, so if you're using recipe books and it says add a tin of beans, add a tin of tomatoes, in my house that means add 1 takeaway tub of beans, 1 takeaway tub of tomatoes, and that's it. I've got a big bowl I've podded, I've had these all out on the counter, fill it, lids on, snap, 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 stack them up, whack them in the freezer. I don't blanch them, I don't bother. What I understand, the thing with blanching is it's supposed to, for some things you would want to do it, but the beans I don't bother, it's supposed to help kind of preserve texture and taste. But generally speaking, if you're going to consume everything within the next sort of 6 months or so, doesn't need blanching, I don't bother. I always go on about these, the takeaway tubs, brilliant, because I can pack them in really, really tightly with each other. Okay, so that's demi-sec, semi-dry. So why do I use this method? Let me just check, I've made a list. So it's quick, it's really, really quick. So we could think about, instead of freezing, of course bottling, or canning as you would say in the States. But of course that's a much longer process, and you have to have your specialist jars, which obviously you keep from year to year, but it's a much longer process. I can't be doing with that sort of faff. So no, for me it's the other convenience about doing the freezing method over dry is I don't have to be really organised in my cooking. So if I mean literally right now, after I finished filming, if I suddenly think to myself, oh, I've got the crust, the drag end of some sourdough bread over there, I could think, oh, I could make my broad bean dip hummus spread thing and have that on some toast for my supper. Oh, actually, I'm now thinking that's what I want for my supper. Brilliant. The broad beans are in the freezer. Hoik them out the freezer, give them a quick cook. I'll tell you about that in a second. You know, 15, 20 minutes later, my supper will be ready. Whereas if I dried them, I'm going to have to think about soaking them and boiling them. So for me, this is my absolute preferred method because it is so quick and easy to do this stage, and it's really quick and easy at the other end, the cooking end. and I'm all about that. So a word on cooking them from frozen, and I'm sorry, excuse me a sec. This isn't about me trying to bring colds to Newcastle. I know teaching your granny to sock eggs, taking ice to the Eskimos, you know all those phrases. I know that there's tons of you who've been doing this for decades, you know all of this inside out. This is purely for those folk, well for anyone who wants to watch, but for those folk who are new to growing their own food, new to preserving it. Hopefully I'm sharing with you the kind of the easiest stuff, so that if you're also still working full-time, bringing up a family, looking after your parents, whatever it is, all of this is really easy stuff to fit in around everything else you do. Now look, if you are you know, if you're independently wealthy, or you have a partner who's going out to work and bringing home the bacon, as it were, and you've got all day, you might want to do your canning. But yeah, quick and easy. So for cooking, you can do one of two things, and I'll tell you what I tend to prefer. I don't bother defrosting them when I take them out, so like I said, back to that example of me doing broad bean hummus on toast for tonight, I won't take them out now and bother defrosting. When it comes to cooking them, I'll have them out, I'll chuck them in my steamer pan and steam them for probably about 10 minutes or so. It really sort of depends how big the bean is, but 10 minutes is enough it will take the frost out of them, give them a bit of a cook, and then I can mash them. Yay! Now, that's because I'm just going to have them on their own, but how about for those beans that I add to things? So often I will add beans to soup, to curries, to stews, what have you, what have you. If I'm adding them to soup, because generally speaking, my soup will be on the hob for, once all the ingredients are in, 20 minutes, a 20-minute simmer. Excuse me, it's really warm today. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we've broken some records in the last couple of days. Yeah, if my soup's, it's only on the hob for like say 20 minutes or so, I could take those, but I'm doing it over there because that's where my freezer is. I could have that handful, and the other thing about freezing like this, if you only want half the portion, I get them out the freezer and I just kind of go, I give them a whack on the side and it loosens them. So I can take the lid off and just take out half a portion, a handful. Again, it makes it really convenient. So if I had bottled them, you know, once I've opened that bottle, you then have to think about using them up, which you probably would anyway. But just in those moments where you only want half of what's in there, again, dead convenient. So yeah, I might grab a handful and I could just chuck them straight into the saucepan with my soup that's cooking. The only thing with that is, of course, it's going to reduce my temperature of the soup instantly because I'm putting something frozen in there. So you could either steam them in a separate pan. So quite often what I'll do if I'm making a soup that I know I want to have beans in, I'll have the beans in the steamer steaming away, and then I'll start my soup base. So that's my onions, carrots, celery, garlic, herbs, spices, whatever it is. I'll be getting that underway, and then by the time that's all underway and I start to chop veg and stock and all the rest in, my beans they've had enough of that frost taken off them to chuck them in. Great, it's not going to slow down my soup cooking time. Of course, doing that is using 2 rings on the cooker. You could put your steamer section on top of your pan with your onions, carrots, celery, your soup starter. That's only 1 ring. Or if you don't mind it taking a bit longer, just chuck them in from frozen and wait for the temperature to come back up. If you're doing something that's a longer cook, like a stew or a casserole or something like that, then yeah, you can just literally chuck them in from frozen. But I do tend to steam them before I add them to anything. Like I say, anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes, takes the frost off. When I add them, I'm not immediately dropping the temperature of the the other pan that I'm cooking in. Okay, so it's all so simple, isn't it? There's probably more, but the two downsides I can think of to doing it this way, of course it's using fuel, isn't it, because the freezer is on. Now one could argue, well, I'm going to have the freezer on anyway because there's going to be other stuff I want to freeze, but you know, until this year I had 3 freezers on the go. Oh, that would be interesting. I haven't thought about this. I haven't really had a close look at my lecky bill. My lecky bill's come down a bit, but then we've been in summer, the lights aren't on. Anyway, it's using up fuel, isn't it? But on the other hand, I'm probably always going to have a freezer because I tend to batch cook. I'll cook a load of stuff in one go, put most of it in the freezer, a couple of bits in the fridge. And even if I didn't have as big a veg garden in future, there's always that possibility that I'm at the greengrocer and wow, the tomatoes are you know, really, really cheap in there at the moment. I want to bulk buy my tomatoes in August, get them processed and into my freezer so that they'll last all through the winter at that crazy low summer price. So yeah, it's a toss-up, isn't it? I'm going to have a freezer on anyway, so I might as well freeze them. But the big downside to that, of course, is what if there's a power cut? Of course, if the power cut is only a few hours, they should all be all right in there. The problem would arise if you were away from home for a week. Say if you're going on holiday somewhere and you have a power cut in a week is long enough for it all to spoil. So that's why I never put all my eggs in one basket. That's why I do some wet and some dry. Coming on to the dry in a second. And in terms of using up my supplies, I always use from the freezer first, just in case of that, you know, the freezer breaking scenario, whether it's a power cut or the you know, because if the freezer broke, if it wasn't a power cut, if the freezer broke, it would probably take me a couple of days to get a new freezer here. So yeah, so I always use my freezer produce first. And over the last few years, you can't see me, I've still got some dried beans and stuff from last year because I've managed to grow enough that by the time I've emptied the freezer of all of last year's produce, this year's produce is coming in. So I don't touch the dry stuff. The dry stuff is there though, if I need it. So, dead easy. Now onto the dried, and why on earth my dried ones have been in the freezer. So this is something I know people kind of get a bit muddled with. It's like, why did you put them in the freezer? Excuse me. So, when to harvest? Oh, flinging them at you. It's bursting open. You can hear, I mean you can hear, can't you? Well, they were rattling until I tipped them out, rattling inside, and you can feel how, you can get a sense of how, I mean that's crispy dry. It's obvious when your beans dry on the vine. So what I tend to do is I leave it as long as possible. I basically ignore any that I'm saving for dry. I ignore them, I ignore them, I ignore them, I ignore them. We're getting to this time of year, October, and this is when I start to think about getting my pods off. I did a whole batch, which is what these are from, the ones in the freezer, and there's some out there on trays still. I did these, it was about the 22nd or so of September, because there were loads that were dry already, and I'd seen a forecast that said 3 or 4 days of non-stop rain. And I thought, you know what, let's just get them in now rather than let them get soaked, absolutely soaked, because I don't want soggy, once dried, now mouldy beans. So for instance, a few more have dried since then. That's now 2 and a bit, it's getting over 3 weeks ago. Where's time going? In the subsequent time, some more have dried, and I think tomorrow is our last day of this bright, dry, gorgeous weather. I'll get all of those off the vine. So yeah, you can leave them and leave them and leave them right till the last minute. Keep an eye on the forecast, and if when it looks like your weather's going to turn and you're going to have a ton of rain, get them in before then. I mean, one of the wonderful reasons for doing your beans dried is it's fantastic if you're a bit of a lazy gardener. Yay for being a lazy gardener. You know, when you've been doing your picking, if you miss a couple, it doesn't matter, you can have them dried. Especially things like runner beans, when they get really big and gnarly, and on the actual pod, I know a lot of you eat the pod gets so gnarly and horrible. Yeah, so if you've missed a few, if you're a bit lazy, or if you just haven't been able to get to your allotment for ages because you might have had some ill health, you might have had family stuff going on that you need to attend to, you may be needy, you know, at work, and you're just like, oh, I can't face the garden this weekend, whatever reason, doing your beans dried, it just takes some of the pressure off, doesn't it? Because you're not trying to catch them at that perfect moment, just leave them. So, let me just check, yeah, leave on the vines until they're rattling. So then you pick all your dried beans, come home, or do it in the garden if it's a nice day, get them all podded. Oh, I love that sound. Now, I can feel, this is one of those things where it's very much about feel as well. Treasure, there's a sort of a sound and a feel to beans when they're dry. I never quite trust, even though that's a really scrunchy pod, I never trust that they're completely dry at this stage. So what I'll do is, on trays, I've got a number of, whatever kind of trays you want to do it on, tea trays, whatever, just spread them out in a single layer and just leave them out. They're all over the floor in the living room, they just stay out. Let them dry, 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 dry. And you can, there is that moment when you can, like I say, it's impossible to explain, it's a feel and a sound, but you can feel. When beans aren't quite dry, they have a slightly lower note. When you're handling them, moving them, dropping them into a bowl or whatever, the note is slightly lower. When they're really, really bone dry, that note is a much higher pitch, and you can feel it in your hand. They're a bit lighter. You just have to feel it to know. But yeah, once they're at that, we're absolutely sure they're bone dry. That's when they go in the freezer for 3 days. Now, I do it with all my dry beans, whether it's beans for eating or beans for seed saving. Someone asked, and it was a really good question, someone asked the other day, if I put them in the freezer, does that mean they won't germinate next year? No, it doesn't mean that at all. I freeze all my seeds for 3 days, and every year you see that they grow. But the reason they can do that, the reason they're not damaged, is because they are bone dry. If there was still moisture in them, that moisture would form ice crystals when it's in the freezer, and then when you take them out, those ice crystals basically rupture the cellular structure of the bean inside, so that when they defrost, those cell structures collapse and then mush and they're good for nothing. So in much the same way, if you think about what would happen to a cucumber if you put it in the freezer and then took it out, it would just be mush. It's because of all that water content. The ice crystals form, they rupture all the little cells that make up your cucumber, and then once it's defrosted, those ruptured cells collapse, become mush. So it's really, really important that you do them bone dry. And the 3-day freeze, it's something that the, excuse me, it's something that the Coanga Institute in New Zealand do. I got it from them years ago when the lovely Dave passed the information on to me. So they go into the jars. Like I say, if it's glass jars, make sure they're food grade glass so they can withstand being frozen. Whatever size, it doesn't matter what the size of container, it can be flat, it can be taut, just as long as it fits in your freezer, for 3 days. That's it, 3 days. Deep freeze, 3 days, come out, back to room temperature. And all we're doing with that is, if there's any, I think it's like shield bugs do it too, bean weevils, if any of them have managed to penetrate a bean and put a larvae in there, the freeze will kill it off. And it doesn't affect the germination, it doesn't affect eating, etc, etc. But what it means is, and I'm sure some of you will experience this, you get to the spring, maybe February, March, things are starting to warm up again, and you look at all your beautiful glass jars, or Tupperware, and I'll show you some Tupperware in a sec too. You can see through, oh, there's all your lovely beans, and then you look and you're like, hang on a minute, what's that? And you can see little black, almost like flies, flitting about in your jars of beans. Ugh, horrible, spoil the lot. This, 3 days in the freezer, this prevents it. So you'll have good bean storage right through winter and into next spring, and nothing hatching in your food storage jars, because it really is off-putting, isn't it? Now I mentioned when they come out, let them come back to room temperature, which obviously they're not, it's far too soon. That lovely frosty bloom has gone from the side of the glass. The reason we want to leave them sealed, just leave them alone, I'll probably do it tomorrow morning to be honest, is if I was to take the lids off now, all this warm, moist, humid air that we live in, that would be attracted, that would be kind of drawn into the jars. I don't want to introduce any kind of moisture to them. So by letting them come to room temperature, when I take the lid off, there's not this kind of pulling in of moist air into that space. So the lid will come off and then I'll store them. For long-term storage, I do use airtight containers. Hang on, because it's out of shot. I just want to show you one of my one of my kilners. Actually, this one's just been emptied, ready for me to fill it again. Oh, ow, ow, ow. So these are my old kilner jars, and I don't have the rubber seals on them. So strictly speaking, they're not airtight. I mean, they're pretty darn near it, but they're not actually airtight. So I have a few beans at a time in these up on the shelves, or rice or my other dry goods, a little bit at a time up there. It's just dead handy for cooking, ease of access. But the rest I put in these, which are, you can probably see that bluish bit in there, that's the seal. I can't get it open. There we go. You can see it's like a little rubber seal in there. So yeah, they go in these bigger pots. I've got a couple that are even bigger than this. So once they're back at room temperature, they'll go in these big Tupperwares, airtight. Then these can go either under the bed, back of the wardrobe, you know, the usual, anywhere I can stash them. And that's why I just keep a few out in the kilner jars in the kitchen, because if you're cooking, you don't want to be rummaging in the back of your wardrobe and under your bed every time, do you? So they, you know, and also they stack, it's dead easy, back of the wardrobe, decant a few at a time for cooking. So, pros and cons with doing the beans dried. It's quick. Again, it's really quick. I'm just podding. There is, you know, in some ways, freezing them demi-sec. We're back to the wet ones. We're back to the wet ones. I knew these pots would come in handy because it just really helps to emphasise the difference. This is, for me, this is the quickest and easiest. The thing with doing the beans dried, obviously podding time, takes about the same time, although I think podding dried pods is always quicker, because the minute you put your thumb at one end, the whole thing flies open, doesn't it? Whereas when the pods are still green and a bit wet, it's a bit... Anyway, podding time is the same. The main difference is they're going to be laid out on trays for some time. I mean, if you've got a spare room, great, but If you're in a smaller place like me, you could end up with just trays of beans everywhere for a couple of weeks as we're into this autumn harvesting season. So that it takes a little bit of time there to just ensure that real thorough dryness, a bit of time and a bit of space. Then there's the being organised, and I'll make a note. I've got my beans into the freezer schedule here. What's the day today? I think it's Monday, yeah, Monday the 9th. I'm making a note of when they've gone into the freezer because honestly, my brain goes everywhere and I'll forget. So just that being a bit organised to get them into the freezer for 3 days. Remember to take them out, swap them, put the others into. So it's a little bit, I mean, you know, seriously, it's not that much effort, is it? Spreading beans on a tray, putting them in the freezer. Once they've done that, decant them into a big Tupperware, airtight. So the prep time, it's not that much, is it? The main thing, of course, with dried beans, it's the cooking time, and I think it's the big put off for a lot of people. But you know, even if you don't grow your own beans, same for any, you know, chickpeas, what have you, even if you don't cook your own, if you don't grow your own, it's almost always, I can't think of an example when it wouldn't be, it's almost always cheaper to buy these things dried than to buy them in tins where they've been reconstituted already. They're cheaper dry, and also as dried you can buy in bulk, which makes it even cheaper. So, you know, for the frugal cook, dry beans, yeah, great. But it's just that faff of remembering the night before to give them a soak. I know some people say, I never soak mine, but I always a bit of a soak and then the boil. And of course, if you've got, you know, if you've got a pressure cooker, or I think some of these, I think, is it called Instapot or Hot Pot? Anyway, some of you I know will have those bits of kit in your kitchen already where it can reduce the cooking time. Great. But if you're just working with bog standard pans and bits of meat, it can be a bit of a faff. So it's a good idea, if you are organising yourself to have a cooking session using dried beans and you put them to soak the night before, do extra. So do a big batch, use one batch for your cooking that day, and then freeze 3 or 4 of the other batches if you've got room in your freezer. Because you may be harvesting and storing your beans dry because there is no room in the freezer, so doing a batch of them is pointless. However, this is the way I would plan it. I'm going to use up all my demi-sec wet green beans. I'll use them all up first for the aforementioned reasons, so that by the spring there should start to be gaps in my freezer. So when we get into spring and I've used these up and I'm moving on to using my dried beans, well, hey presto, do a big batch and freeze 4 or 5 of those portions which have had the overnight soak and the boil, so that next time I'm cooking I can just grab a batch of those from the freezer, if that makes sense. If I missed anything, made a few notes late last night. No, I don't think I've missed anything, but yeah, that question about the germination, your seeds do have to be bone dry to stop that cell rupture thing happening with ice crystals forming. But I think that's it. No, we'll ignore that. We'll do that another day. So I hope that's clarified, particularly that 3-day freeze thing. It's to stop your food spoiling by things hatching next February or March. It gives me the icks. Both methods, dead easy. It all boils down to, I suppose, what's convenient for you, both in terms of harvesting and preserving, and what's convenient at the other end, the cooking end. Obviously, the thing about the dried ones is it's a great way to store any that you just happen to have missed in the garden, or that you've been too lazy to pick. We all have those moments. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. Me. We all have those times, don't we? We just don't keep on top of the harvest, and they go past the best and we think, oh, compost bin. No, just leave them on the vines to dry. All right, my lovelies, I think next time I see you is going to be the garden. Like I was mentioning the other day, it's harvest time. What a great time of year. It really is, isn't it? When we just, all our hard work has come to this. And obviously there'll be some bits and bobs left in the ground over winter, but really the next sort of couple of weeks or so, we'll see all of the rest of the beans coming off the vines and coming home. All of the, oh my God, the tomatoes, so many tomatoes, and you know, I'll need to do a big calendula harvest, the squash, everything I was mentioning the other day. I'm mentioning it again because I'm excited for it. So I will see you really soon in the garden. But in the meantime, yeah, happy harvesting and happy processing and preserving and storing your gorgeous, precious produce all by your own hands. Isn't it great? I hope you're all really, really proud of yourselves for literally every single morsel you've grown this year. You know, good on you! Yay! All right, lovelies, until the next one, cheerio.